Chairman Powell, during your testimony before the Joint Economic Committee last year, you were asked about what steps the Federal Reserve is taking to assess the impacts of climate change on our financial system. In your testimony, you made the distinction between the purely informative stress test for climate risk that the Bank of England does and what the U.S. stress testing regime under CCAR does, which is impact and inform capital requirements for capital distributions. My understanding is the Bank of England is conducting research and asking financial institutions to think through their portfolios and how they could be impacted, but they're not currently integrating those measures into capital requirements. Would you outline some of what the Fed is doing in terms of research and engagement on global climate risk?
Sure. So I should begin by saying that climate risk is climate change is a very important issue that Congress has largely assigned to other agencies. It does play into our work, however, as it relates to the public's very reasonable expectation that we would make sure that the financial sector, the banks, the utilities that we supervise are resilient against the longer-term risks from climate change. So we're in very early days of understanding what all that means. And so there's work going on around the world at central banks to try to figure that out. You talked about the Bank of England stress tests. Those are not intended to inform current capital requirements, but more informed to understand what might be the effects on banks from climate change.
Are you planning on joining the network for greening the financial system?
We haven't made a decision about that. We've always attended their meetings. I mean, I guess my theory is when you join an organization like that, you're not necessarily, signing up for everything that everybody there believes. You can benefit from the work that's being done there, and we're kind of doing that now. We've not made a decision about membership.
Vice Chairman Quarles recently outlined changes that would increase supervision, transparency, and accountability. And I was encouraged by those comments, and we'll be following this closely, of course. One change the Vice Chairman outlined is that the Federal Reserve should restore supervisory observations, which will allow notice of a supervisory concern without it rising to the level of a matter requiring attention. Can you tell us what the timeline is that you see on those proposals to improve supervision?
Timeline is hard to say. I would just say what the Vice Chair did was he pointed to this tension that exists between very fundamental expectations of due process, transparency, and fairness around everything the government does, and should be associated with that, but also with supervision, which by its nature is private and somewhat discretionary, non-public, and confidential, really. So he pointed out that tension and the need to shed more light on that and to ask whether there are places where supervision needs to incorporate more of that due process thinking. I think that's a very healthy thing to think about, and it's something we'll be working on.
In light of the coronavirus, Chairman, I can't help but think about, as a young man, as a boy, I spent a lot of time around my parents, my grandparents, I should say, and my great aunts and uncles. They were born just after the previous century. So their tales of firsthand experience in the pandemic of 1918 and 1919 were very graphic as it rolled through rural western Oklahoma. And the reason I bring this up is their description of that particular virus at that particular time in that particular rural society was that literally it brought everything to a stop for weeks in rural western Oklahoma. Now, my mother's family, my father's family were very fortunate. No one died from what was called the Spanish flu, but it brought society to a stop. The reason I ask that is, with 43,000 cases worldwide and the critical impact in China, could you describe for a moment how China and its neighboring countries are responding to the economic impact of coronavirus in general and from the perspective of your fellow central bankers in those countries?
I think they're really responding now to the outbreak and containing it. And the Chinese government has obviously taken very strong measures on that. You see businesses closing down in the affected areas. You see that sort of thing. In terms of the economy, as you asked, the People's Bank of China has done a number of things to support economic activity, and I think you can expect the Chinese government to do lots of things to support economic activity, and they've said that they're open to cushioning the economic effects. We're not seeing it, we're not able yet to estimate the size of the economic effects. There are many estimates out there, but I think you'll see governments acting in Asia, particularly in China, to offset those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back, Madam Chair.